But these stories, they've been capturing the imagination of Jewish children for thousands of years and inspiring the parents that are telling them these stories, who are faced with the same challenges that Avraham was faced in his life. And so the first story is about Avraham when he first began to think, right? And this is the way Maimonides describes it in his magnum opus, right? In the Mishnah Torah, if you've heard about it, he said like this: after he was weaned, meaning Avraham, while still an infant, his mind began to reflect. Day and night he thought and wondered, how is it possible that this celestial sphere should be continuously guiding the world without something to guide it and cause it to revolve? For it cannot move of its own accord. He had no teacher or mentor because he was immersed in Ur Kasdim, in Ur of the Chaldees, among foolish idolaters. His father and mother and the entire population worshipped idols, and he worshipped with them. He continued to speculate and reflect until he achieved the way of truth, understanding what was right through his own efforts. It was then that he knew that there is one God who guides the heavenly bodies, who created everything, and besides whom there is no other God. So that's what Maimonides says. Now, I remember learning the actual logical deduction that he made. It was so fascinating to me. I've reviewed it so many times in my life. And I should say here that I really spent some time looking for the actual source that this was the logical deduction. I couldn't find it. But nonetheless, take it or leave it, I think it holds up. So Avram was a boy, as we said, and he was just starting to consider and to using his cognition. And he looked at nature bravely and fearlessly, and he was reflecting on it, and he was just seeking truth with such fervor that he didn't let the fear of the consequences of the conclusion to which he would come, cloud his thinking or obfuscate the way he was thinking about things. Okay, so he looked at nature and he realized that it was finite. And therefore, I'm trying to make it tighter here, he realized nature was finite, and therefore something had to have created it. And what would have created the first finite thing? People worship the stars, but they were finite also. The only thing that could create the finite world outside of the finite is the infinite. And if something is infinite, it definitionally, it lacks nothing. So the only reason for this infinite being to create the world is to give. So I want to hear from you, your thoughts about that deduction, if you want to share them, because there's a lot to discuss there. But that's how he came to the understanding that a single infinite God created the world in order to give and bestow goodness to the world. And you see, at the beginning of his journey, it was his intellectual and philosophical quest for truth that led him to Hashem. And by the way, it was very much the same for me when I was a kid. I remember just reading books and arguing, and I was like, I came to the conclusion that what is the greatest service of God was intellectual honesty, being true to that which you know is true, and seeking truth no matter where it will possibly lead you. I remember when I started learning about the Torah and the Sabbath, I was learning about it in order not to keep the Sabbath. I've shared this with you about the Sabbath. I didn't want to keep it, but the more I studied it, the more it resonated as true to the deepest level. And then I was stuck there keeping the Sabbath, walking 3 miles through the miserable, humid armpit heat of Houston, Texas, because I had to study it to figure out that it wasn't true. Anyways, so that's where Abraham started. But nonetheless, we see that eventually he graduated or evolved to the level, from the level of intellectual understanding to a greater level of relationship with the divine that we see in chapter 15, when Hashem says to Abraham, Genesis chapter 15, that one shall not inherit you. He's talking about Eliezer, of course. I had to start somewhere. Only him that comes forth from within you shall inherit you. And he took him outside and said, gaze now towards the heavens and count the stars if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he trusted in Hashem, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. So now this teaches us as children, at a certain point, we need to retire the intellect and let it go and just trust in Hashem, even if we cannot possibly fathom how any sort of salvation could ever arrive for us, or even if from our very limited human perspective, we can't possibly grasp where redemption would come from. That's what King David said. Shir ha'ma'alot esa einai el harim ma'ayin yavo ezri. Right, a song of ascents. Let my eyes look towards the mountains. Ma'ayin yavo ezri. Where will my help arrive from? He didn't know where his help would come from, but we don't need to understand. Simple faith is arguably Abraham's most beautiful legacy. So Rav Meir Shapiro of Lublin, he taught another Abrahamic quality from that same verse. And I really enjoyed this when I read it. I wanted to share it with you. Now listen to the verse carefully, right? Gaze now towards the heavens and count the stars if you are able to count them. And he said, so shall your offspring be. So Rav Shapiro taught that although it's impossible to count the stars, Avram was instructed to do so by Hashem, so he immediately started counting. And when he did, Hashem said, this is how your children are going to be. Meaning that when the children of Avram are given a commandment or led in a certain way, it doesn't matter if it seems totally impossible, they're going to count the stars. They're going to count the stars even if it's impossible. If intellectually it seems that there's no way to fulfill it, doesn't matter. When God tells us to do something, we do it without calculating whether it's a realistic achievement or not. We leave the how in Hashem's hands. And I believe that doing so would be reckoned to us as righteousness, right? We just go into the sea until we're about to drown. How is it? What's going to happen here? Where's the redemption? And then God will part the sea. Okay, so now the next two stories are often told separately, but in reality, they're interconnected. And I'll tell the stories exactly as the great Rav Elimelech Biderman tells them. And as I told them to Dvash, my little delicious Dvash, just the other night. I know I'm not supposed to show any pictures, but it's really, you can blame Jeremy. Send an email to jeremy@thelandofisrael.com and say, Ari's not showing pictures of Dvash because of you. I hope you're happy, Jeremy. That's an exact quote. Anyways, I was telling her the story the other night, and although she did not understand a word, I really think she enjoyed the experience just based on how zealously she was pulling on my beard. Okay, so here it goes. The Midrash relates that Terach manufactured and sold idols. And one day he had to go somewhere, and he asked his son Avraham to send the to tend to the idol store that day. And a customer entered requesting to purchase an idol. And Avraham asked him, how old are you? And the man replied that he was about 60 years old. And Avraham said, woe to someone who is 60 years old and bows down to an idol that was just made today. And the man left, and he was embarrassed, and he recognized the foolishness of his faith. Then a woman carrying a bowl of flour came into the shop, and she said to Avraham, sacrifice this to the idols, and she left. So Avraham, he had it. He took a hammer and he smashed all the idols in the store except for one big idol, and he placed the hammer in the hand of that remaining idol, the largest one. And his father Terach returned to him, and he demanded, who did this? Right? His entire inventory was destroyed. And Avram replied, I'll tell you the truth. A woman asked me to give a bowl of flour to the idols. And all the idols wanted the flour, and they began to fight. And one said, I should eat first. And the other said, give it to me first. And it was a big mess. And then this tall idol grabbed a hammer and broke all of the smaller idols. And Terach replied, why are you lying to me? These idols don't know anything. They can't do anything. And Avram responded, do your ears hear what your mouth is saying? Listen to what you just said. If they don't know anything and they can't do anything, why do you worship them? Right? So Terach was enraged, and he brought Avraham, his own son, to King Nimrod, who would most likely execute him, right? So Nimrod ordered to Avram, bow down to the fire. And Avram replied, why not bow down to water? Because water puts out fire. So Nimrod said, fine, bow down to the water. And Avram said, why not bow down to the clouds? Because the clouds actually carry the water. And Nimrod said, okay, bow down to the clouds. And Avram responded, but why not bow down to the wind? Because the wind blows the clouds. And Nimrod, he said, okay, so bow down to the wind. And Avram said, so why not worship a human being? Because he actually carries the wind within him. And Nimrod said, you're speaking foolishness. I worship fire, and I'm going to throw you into the fire. And let the God who you bow down save you. So Avram's brother, Haran, by the way, he was present. and he wasn't certain which side to take in this whole thing. And so he said to himself, if Avraham is saved from the furnace, I'm going to say I'm with Avraham. And if Nimrod wins, then I'm going to be with Nimrod, right? It makes sense. And so what happened? So they threw Avraham into the burning furnace, and he wasn't burned. He was saved. And then they asked Haran, whose side are you on? And he replied, I'm with Avraham. So they threw him into the furnace, and his innards were burned. He was burned to death. As it states actually in the Torah, Vayamat Haran al pnei terach. The terach caused Haran's death. That's what it says. And so this is sort of the backstory to that, and that's how. But we also learn that although he wasn't on the level of Avraham, he still had the courage and deserved merit for taking that stand. And it was a reward for that, our sages say, that Haran merited to have the Mashiach descend from him. Messiah descended from him, right through his son Lot, right through Moab to Ruth to King David, to the final Mashiach. And it's just, I just like explaining that because Hashem doesn't let a good deed or even a good motivation, even if it's incomplete and it's imperfect, he doesn't let that go unrewarded. As the masks are coming off and much of the world is turning not only against Israel, but yes, against the Jewish people, if you feel different, if your love for Israel is growing deeper and stronger, if you're thirsting to cleave to the nation of Israel and to the God of Israel, if you're thirsting to learn authentic Torah from Jews in Judea, then the Land of Israel Fellowship is for you. Hundreds of individuals and families from around the world come together on Zoom every week in what can only be described as a fellowship of love, friendship, of learning and praying and belonging. A fellowship really unlike any other. It's more than just a movement, it's a family. To learn more about the Land of Israel Fellowship, click on www.thelandofisrael.com/fellowship or send an email to fellowship@thelandofisrael.com. Love and blessings from Judea.